lipids for hibernation time. Stocking up on salmon, nuts, and berries will be fine. Seals use the lipids to make their blubbery skin, giving them protection from the cold Arctic wind.
Alright, so we're going to start talking about lipids. Lipids are named in a very specific way, and it's pretty straightforward on how they're named. There are some common names to lipids, like stearic acid and oleic acid. You will not need to know the common names, but how to name them systematically. So let's look at a lipid or a fatty acid. So lipids are composed of fatty acids. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Alright, so they're called fatty acids because of acids, talking about their carboxylic acid group, and fatty because it's a long chain of hydrocarbons. You have a double bond there. So how do we name lipids? So what we do is we take the total number of carbons, colon, the number of double bonds, followed by a delta, and then the first carbon of the double bond. So let's look at this fatty acid as an example. So let's count the carbons. We always start with the carbon of the carboxylic acid group. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So let's name this fatty acid. Total number of carbons is 18. We have one double bond, and that double bond starts at carbon number 9. So this would be the name of this fatty acid. Let's look at an example of another fatty acid. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Alright, here's another fatty acid with obviously a lot more double bonds in it. So let's go ahead and name this fatty acid. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. So, we are going to name this acid, or fatty acid, 20 carbons. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 double bonds, and we have to put the carbon where they start. So the common name of this fatty acid, icosa pentaenoic acid. So icosa pentaenoic acid, or EPA. It's a very common acid, or a very common fatty acid. We're counting, if you notice, I said we count this way. When we count this way, it's known as alpha, and we do put a delta. That denotes the double bonds and the carbons where they come from. We can, if we wanted to, count the other way. So let's count that way. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. When we count the opposite way, it is known as omega. So alpha going from the carboxylic acid way, omega coming from the other way. To name this, it's still the same. We have 25, but instead of a delta, we put an omega. And so we have an omega 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. So, when we talk about omega-3 fatty acids and how good they are for us, because they are very good, and we'll talk about maybe later in class why, this is where we get that omega from. So this is an omega-3, 6, 9 fatty acid, and those are very, very good for us. If you've noticed, in the two fatty acids we've talked about, they are cis double bonds, right? So this carbon and this carbon are on the same side of the double bond, making it a cis. All naturally occurring fatty acids have a cis bonds. So, when we talk about fatty acids, how do we get one of these? Let's redraw that. I'll just draw a fatty acid. How do we get those? Those are known as trans fats. The reason how we get this is we partially hydrogenate our fatty acids. When we partially hydrogenate, we don't fully hydrogenate the fatty acid to where it becomes this. If we fully hydrogenated it, it would become a saturated fatty acid. And you might have heard from a variety of different people that saturated fats are really bad for you, whereas unsaturated fats are really good for you, and trans fats are the worst of all. And when we talk about beta oxidation, we'll talk about why trans fats are so bad. Trans fats, saturated fats, as you can kind of tell, can line up if we were to put them together. So when we talk about things like butter or lard or any other saturated fat source, those usually are solid at room temperature because of this. Whereas if we look at unsaturated fats, where we have these together, what these do, when you see this cis double bond, is they actually kink the rest of that tail. And so when you have kinks in tails, they don't line up nice and evenly. This is why unsaturated fats, things like olive oil and canola oil, all of these fats are liquid at room temperature. So lipids are degraded by what's known as lipases. These are known as especially things like phospholipases. And you have A, B, C, so on and so forth. And so what these phospholipases do is that they cleave the fatty acid and or the lipid, which is composed of multiple fatty acids, in particular, very specific portions of that lipid. Some of them, so let's say we put a bunch of fatty acids together into a lipid. This is what it would look like. and there would be, these are known as triacyl glycerides because there's 3 fatty acids. They're glycerides because this region of the fatty acid is glycerol. Right? It's the glycerol backbone. And what we see with these lipases is some lipases are able to cut right here, removing the glycerol from the fatty acids. Some lipases cut here, shrinking the size of the fatty acids to remove them and to further degradation, to allow them to degrade even further. There is a specific lipase called hexose aminidase A. When you do not have hexosaminidase A, you have an accumulation of lipids. When you have an accumulation of lipids, especially in the brain, this is known as Tay-Sachs disease. So these lipases play a very important role in our health. And so if we've lost one, then we can tend to get diseases of lipid storage, things like Tay-Sachs. So fatty acids and cholesterol are transported in a very specific way through our body. Just to briefly touch on that, there are things that we'll see called LDLs. This is low density lipids. We also have things like VLDLs, which is very low density lipids. We also have things like HDL, or high density lipids. And these are packages that help transport cholesterol. We'll talk about cholesterol in a minute, as well as the fatty acids throughout our body. And obviously, this is good, and this is bad. And we'll explain later in class on why HDL is very good and LDL is very bad. So, there are some essential amino acids, or fatty acids. Just like there are essential amino acids, these essential fatty acids are very important because they produce what are known as local hormones. Hormones that don't circulate throughout the body. We'll look at cholesterol and cholesterol-based hormones after this. So let's look at one. Let's look at an essential fatty acid. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So there's a 20 carbon fatty acid. It's got 4 double bonds. This is known as arachidonic acid. So arachidonic acid is an essential amino acid. It's found in your brain, your muscles, or your liver. So we have 5, 6, 8, 11, 12, 13, and then 14. The 2 that we're going to focus on are carbon number 8 8 and carbon number 12. And the reason why we're going to focus on these, let's get back to blue, is because this fatty acid in solution can actually start to circularize a little bit. And so what you get is this. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whoops. Forgot the double bond at 5. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So as I was counting, as we were drawing these, we said the most important ones are at 8 and at 12. And what can actually happen is that these two can form a bond right there. And we'll talk about in class what actually happens, what's actually made when we do this. But what we see is something called a thromboxane or thromboxane, as well as prostaglandins. And so one of the things that we're going to see is that thromboxanes and prostaglandins are very important things, especially for the mucus lining of your stomach. We'll talk about COX-2 and COX-1 inhibitors with aspirin. These things are very, very, very important. And we wouldn't have them if we didn't have essential fatty acids. So, cholesterol. Cholesterol, the basis of cholesterol, or the backbone of cholesterol, looks like this. Whoops, put it on the wrong face. There we go. Redo that corner. There we go. So as you can tell, it is a very in-depth structure. I'll just put an R there. So that's the backbone, if you will, of the cholesterol. There are things, depending on what kind of decorations we have on it, we can turn it into different things. Things like bile acids, right? Bile acids, we can modify the cholesterol. It makes a great detergent. We can change the backbone to make it into hormones like cortisol and cortisone and aldosterone. We can make it into anabolic steroids. We can turn it into what's known as brassinosteroids in plants. So this is the backbone of cholesterol, and we can turn cholesterol and this backbone into a variety of different things depending on the R, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in class. So there are vitamins that are also fat-soluble. So vitamin C is not a fat-soluble vitamin. You can take as much vitamin C as you want. However, the fat-soluble vitamins, you have to be careful because you can get a toxic level of fat-soluble vitamins. What are some fat-soluble vitamins? Things like vitamin D. Things like vitamin E. Vitamin K. We'll talk about vitamin K is great for blood clotting, and that actually after a baby is born, one of the first shots they get is vitamin K. Vitamin E is a great antioxidant. Vitamin D is great because it causes release of a calcium catcher And so usually when you take a calcium supplement, there is some vitamin D associated with it. And then that way you'll be able to do those things and get more calcium. And then, but vitamin D, one of the only ways you can get vitamin D is if you go outside. And the sun plays a role in maturing vitamin D. And then the last one that you guys will have to know about is vitamin A. So vitamin A, the precursor of vitamin A is known as beta-carotene. Carrots are very high in beta-carotene. You can overdo it on the carrots. So I would recommend looking up these different vitamins, and we'll talk about this more in class.
I'm all about that base, no acid. I'm all about that base, no acid. I'm all about that base, base. Yeah, it's pretty clear, I ain't no science fool. So you got litmus, well I can turn it blue. Make it go boom, boom all over the place. When all the H plus meet all the OHs.